My project for our Radical Modes of Design module is about noticing, specifically in relation to ecology and our sense of place. It's about radical curiosity and whether it can help us connect with the world around us. To many, the word radical means to shock or to exist outside of accepted frameworks. Whilst radical does mean to disrupt, the etymology of the word also means to proceed from the root. When the world around us seems to move at an incredibly fast pace, it is disruptive to be slow, to stop, and to notice. In this project, I explored some different ways of being and alternative modes of design that seek to unsettle and challenge dominant paradigms of anthropocentrism. Life exists on multiple scales and speeds, but many of us are tuned into interactions that occur on the human point of these scales. Would our outlook on life be different if we noticed the lives at the smaller end of the scale? How often do you notice the tiny plants growing on the land or the buildings where you live? Moss and lichen are pioneer species, some of the first inhabitants to take up residence on trees, rocks, gateposts, churches, pavements, even arid deserts in the case of lichen. Through their cycles of birth, life, and death across deep time, they begin to create foundation soils which capture carbon and in which other species can grow. Lichen can also act as indicators of air quality, both detecting pollution and revealing microfaunal biodiversity. If we could learn to read them, they could teach us more about the world around us. They could sound alarms or point towards well-being that may benefit not just humans in urban spaces, but all life. I drew inspiration for my project from moss and lichen growing on gravestones. Some revealed and emphasized letters and symbols, whilst others covered them up completely and shifted them into new forms. The original idea for my project was to carve a message into stone and infill the letters with moss. The aim was to see if I could enable the moss to capture the human viewer's attention so they could think about the perspective of another species. However, through the process of collecting, making, and connecting, I realized in my attempts to locate the voice of another species, I was not really listening. An internet search returned suggestions for mixing moss and natural yogurt in a blender to encourage moss to grow on stone. This technique seemed too violent for a project which is about interspecies connection. Instead, I tried to handle the moss gently. I used scissors at first, but switched to using my hands to break it apart more delicately. This approach was reminiscent of conservation work on peatlands, where mosses are broken apart by hand to move them to an area of bare peat. Yet breaking the moss's natural forms to arrange it into the shapes of letters still did not feel right. Over time, I realized I needed to change my approach to carve indents in the stone that are shaped to the individual mosses so they could retain their existing form. Scientist and member of the Potawatomi Indigenous Nation, Robin Wk2 discusses the honourable harvest, which I encourage you to read. It involves acknowledgement and reciprocity, not just taking, but also giving. Ecologist David Abram notes that animism is a common thread throughout traditionally oral Indigenous cultures. He proposes that cultures that developed written traditions may have modified what is a kind of default setting for our species, that in the absence of intervening technologies, the human senses spontaneously encounter the sensorial surroundings as a field of sensitive and sentient powers. He makes the case that whilst those of us from Western technology-infused cultures might like to think otherwise, human experience is rooted in participatory and animistic experience. Most of us hear an internal voice when we read, and we have created devices that speak to us. We might not be ready to fully embrace the concept of animism, but can noticing allow us to be radically curious about it? Designer Louise St. Pierre observes that animist awareness brings a fierce questioning of modern Western priorities in design. I have realized this to be true in my own creative practice working with moss. In the final piece, I chose a sandstone offcut, which already had some moss growing on the outer edge. This suggested to me that it could be a suitable foundation for other moss to live on. I carved the text, "Letters disappear," into the stone. Alongside the lettering, I also carved custom shapes for bits of moss that I planted. I hoped that the text would capture the human observer's attention and draw them to notice the moss and spend some time considering it. However, I realised that in a way, the letters are irrelevant. The piece is really home to the moss, and I cannot control how the moss moves on a stone. The letters I carved remain, but are not the focus of the final piece. The project output is a photo of a moss sitting in an indentation carved to its shape. It is an attempt to create a niche for it to be home in, on a stone where other mosses grow. When I look closely at the piece, I see that the leaves look like flowers, twisted at the ends like rope. Sometimes the moss is lush and green, like a tiny forest viewed from above. At other times it is dry, and it is as though its life is held in suspended animation, waiting for the rain. The photo invites the viewer to form their own personal insight and connections with the mosses and the stone. And just to say, here is the moss on 2 different days. So you can see in one, it's just rained and it's looking a bit happier. Within human languages, innumerable concepts exist which don't have direct translations between cultures. These inform how we see and interact with the world and the realities that are created. Designer Yoko Akama discusses how design in Japan has co-evolved with the Japanese concept of ma, which roughly translates as empty but not absent space. Robin Wall-Kimmerer explains an approximate translation of the Potawatomi word papawi as the force which causes mushrooms to push up from the earth overnight. Designer Sally Sutherland speaks of the importance of considering the unobserved, invisible, silences and silenced in design decisions through the medium of noticing. Through noticing beyond our experiences, there are opportunities to change the way we view ourselves in relation to the world around us and other living beings. Through expanding these insights, might we design different outcomes that could be less human-centric? We often try to make sense of non-human processes through anthropological concepts, such as scientific or economic reasoning. Robert Macfarlane suggests that a new language for understanding non-human species is needed that doesn't convert it to our own use values. He suggests that maybe we need to speak in spores. To be able to stop and notice could be said to be a necessary radical act for some and a luxury for others. The project does not assume that everyone will have the time, mental space, or inclination to notice or care, but it may sow some seeds of wonder about our entangled lives and fates for those that do. Hopefully the moss will grow and thrive regardless. Whether the moss stays in the indents or grows into the lettering cannot be controlled by humans, nor can we control the speed of growth. It may take years for it to establish, if at all. In Superflux's More Than Human manifesto, they outlined their vision for how humankind can think beyond itself. This offers a creative vision for reorienting future trajectories in ways that are not limited to human priorities. Visions can only take us so far, but they provide important foundations. As Donna Haraway observes, it matters what matters we use to think other matters with. Having a starting point is the key, but whether that's through mosses, birds, or rivers does not really matter. Connection can grow if we can find a route to start from. This project is about noticing life on a minute scale, but it's also about noticing the more than human in general. Entangled lives are everywhere, even in our urban landscapes. Animal physiologist and biochemist Margaret McFall-Nye highlights the loss of unknown symbiotic partners may disrupt an entire ecosystem. In noticing, we may discover entanglements that are beneficial or harmful to the symbiotic partners and anywhere in between. By being aware of them, we can better consider the implications of losing them. It involves a shift in seeing ourselves as not as isolated individuals, to realize that everything is interconnected. In our times of multiple crises, it may be helpful to try different ways of seeing and being in the world. Noticing will mean different things to different people, and it is not presented as a solution. Yet language can create and recreate our realities. If we can open up wondering in human observers, can we form the seeds of empathy and connection to non-human life? I'd like to close with another quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer. Learning the grammar of animacy could well be a restraint on a mindless exploitation of land. We don't have to figure everything out for ourselves. There are intelligences other than our own, teachers all around us. Imagine how less lonely the world would be.